By the way, my name is Joe Royce, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program here at North Carolina State University. That's where we're hosting today's seminar. The Southern Fire Exchange is a regional program for fire science delivery in the Southeast, funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. Today, we're very excited to have as our special guest speaker one of the founding members of the Southern Fire Exchange, which is Dr. Toddi Steelman. She's an acclaimed political scientist. She actually convinced me of its worth. A distinguished scholar, and she's currently executive director and professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. But more important, she is co-director with Branda Noel of the Fire Chasers. So that's a neat project going on here at North Carolina State. The title of Dr. Steelman's presentation is Wildfire Policy as a Socio-Ecological Problem. Following the presentation, once she's stopped talking, we'll have time for open questions and answers. For those of you attending remotely, if you could just write down your questions or comments, and you can put them into the chat space on WebEx, and we will answer those at the end. Those of you in the audience right here can just raise your hand and ask questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Toddi Steelman.
Thank you, Joe. Is this on? Can you guys hear me through that? I don't know if I turned it on in the back. I just want to make sure. Yep, it looks like we're okay. Just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Thank you very much, Joe. Joe organized this for me, and I'm very grateful. It's wonderful to see a lot of old faces, old friends, and faces that I've missed since moving to Saskatchewan up in Canada 4 years ago. So it's a real pleasure to be back here and to be part of the Southern Fire Exchange again. So thank you very much. Today, I want to talk to you about wildfire as a socio-ecological problem. The talk is going to be between 35 and maybe 40 minutes, so I think we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. In many ways, it's a call for reflection and action. I've been involved in wildland fire work for 15 years now, 16 years now. And during that time, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of communities, a lot of incident commanders, incident management teams, and other folks, researchers over the many years. And during that time, I think it's not only has it been a privilege to work with those folks, but having been doing it for about 15 years, I think it's important to reflect on whether or not you're being effective. And so that's partly what I'm doing today. So thank you all for coming, and we'll get on our way. What did I do with the thing? There it is. All right. So prior to 2000, wildland fire research was predominantly focused on biophysical processes. And then starting in 1998 and 2000 respectively, the Joint Fire Science Program and the National Fire Plan started funding social science. And so since that time, if we think about that time frame, 15 years of research later, we should be asking ourselves whether or not we've been effective. And one of the things I've learned during that period, and one of the reasons I've titled the talk as I have, is that as a social scientist, increasingly it's important for me to be working with folks from other disciplines, biophysical scientists and especially ecologists, because I think that's how we actually get to the heart of understanding a lot of the very complex issues that face us as folks who study wildland fire. And so one of the things we should be asking ourselves is, are we effective? And if we were effective, how would we actually know that? So I raised the issue, do we have a problem in terms of where wildland fire policy is today? Open question. And would we know it if we actually saw it? I think we do have a problem, and what I would like to spend some time today on is diagnosing it and unpacking it a little bit and providing some actions that we might engage in to deal with it. And while I'm being a bit critical of the work that has gone on in the past, in no way am I trying to impugn the wonderful work that's been done by folks out on the front lines or fire managers or other researchers who have been working in this field. As we all know, these are very complicated, wicked kinds of problems. They have no easy solutions. But if we don't engage in some reflection, we can't make progress. So it's a good-natured sort of constructive criticism. And while my comments are really focused in the U.S. context, I think it is important to recognize that similar problems are going on in Australia and in Canada, my new home country. So it's just something to keep in mind. So let's start with our current goals. A good place to, if you've got a problem, a good way to orient yourself is by looking at what your goals are. And so one of the things I started to look at was U.S. wildfire policy, starting in 1995 and coming through the present, so the last 20 years of wildland fire policy. So why 1995? In 1994, that was the year of Storm King Mountain and the South Canyon wildfire, where 14 wildland firefighters lost their lives. And so that started a really important period of reflection and action in our country related to wildland fire. And that reflection continues today, because it was only in 2013 that the Granite Mountain hotshots experienced a real tragedy, and 19 lives were lost in that hotshot crew. So again, it's really sort of interesting when you think about those two bookends and where we've been and where we have been going with wildland fire policy. So what I decided to do was take a hard look at all the different policies that we have, and I did a bit of a thematic analysis. So I'm a social scientist by training, and so I started to look at all the different goals laid out in all of those policies. And what do they tell us? Well, there's one cluster that says one of our goals is to respond appropriately to wildfire. Another one is to restore fire-adapted ecosystems. Another goal is to build fire-adapted communities. Another goal is to reduce hazardous fuels. And yet another goal is agency coordination and community cooperation. So we end up with these 5 goals. And a legitimate question is, well, how are we doing with respect to those goals, right? If those are our goals and we've laid them out as a nation, how are we doing in terms of making progress on them? So I set out to try to collect a bunch of data, the data that are available, to try to understand how we are doing with respect to those particular goals. So these data are imperfect, as are all data, but they are the data that are available, publicly available through our federal agencies and other sources, to basically help us understand whether or not we are making progress towards these particular goals. So I'm going to walk through these 5 and just present some data around them. So if our first one is restore fire-adapted ecosystems, some of the data we collect are acres moving towards desired conditions and acres that are maintained in desired conditions. And as you can see, the trend is downward, so not in the direction we would like. Prescribed fire. If we're trying to restore fire-adapted ecosystems, prescribed fire is important, something very close to all of you here in the South, and certainly the Southern Fire Exchange. So these are data from the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, and what they are basically saying is that total acres in prescribed fire are flat or trending upwards just a little bit. I think there are others who would contend this data because it's really hard to track prescribed burning. If we move on to the second goal, build fire-adapted communities, the percentage of acres treated in the wildland-urban interface in something we'll call Community Wildfire Protection Plans, or CWPPs. Those are plans that are put together by communities in collaboration with federal and state agencies and local organizations to identify their priorities. And so this is actually a positive trend, a good trend. More acres are being treated in the wildland-urban interface through community wildfire protection plans. The number of stewardship contracts is also increasing over time. Stewardship contracts are mechanisms employed by the U.S. Forest Service that allow non-conventional contracts or sales to take place, so that things like small diameter fuels can be removed from a property, ecosystem restoration practices could take place, you could create a fuel break, you could put work to biofuels. It's sort of contracts that would be outside of the merchantable timber kind of arena. And anyway, it allows you to engage in sort of some of this restoration kind of work, and they're on the climb, which is a very good thing. But if we look at structures lost over time, what we see are increasing trends. So these are total structures and primary structures. So primary structures will be your first home, basically, in terms of what that looks like over time. So if we move on to the third goal, respond appropriately to wildfire, we're also seeing sort of trends related to wildland firefighting fatalities increasing over time, and that last one there in 2013 reflects that Granite Mountain hotshot tragedy of which I just spoke. The percentage of fires not contained on initial attack that exceed something called the stratified cost index estimate. So that's an estimated cost per acre that is normalized to predict how much it should cost to fight that acre of wildfire. And so what this is saying is that basically those costs are exceeded, and that's not such a good thing. continuing on with responding appropriately to wildfires, so that's that third goal. Total fires by year have sort of flatlined or are going down. When we think about wildfire, it's hard to know if this is a positive trend or a negative trend, because in a world where we'd want more fire on the land, we might want more fires. So is this a positive trend or a negative trend? Hard to know, actually. Same thing with total acres burned. So what we're seeing is that while total fires are flat or trending downwards, what we're seeing is total acres burned are heading upwards. So again, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Hard to know, because a lot of it depends on the quality of the fire on the landscape. If it's good fire, healthy fire, then that's actually a very positive trend. If it's not, then it's a negative trend. So it really depends on that fire that's out there on the landscape. So hard to know. Total appropriations to wildfire accounts, increasing over time. That's a worrisome trend, because what we're seeing, at least with the Forest Service, is that increasingly a proportion of their budget is being dedicated to fighting fire, which leaves less and less left over to actually mitigate, to prepare for that fire. Moving on to the fourth goal, reduce hazardous fuels. We're seeing positive trends in this area, which are appropriations to fuel reduction are on the climb for the most part. Those 2 years, FY08 and FY09, have spikes in them because those were the years of the American Renewal and Reinvestment Act. So there was a lot of money that was put into the system at that time, so that causes a bit of a spike. So you can see what that's done. Acres treated in the WUI or non-WUI in terms of hazardous reduction. WUI acres are on the upswing, non-WUI acres sort of flat. We would want those acres to be treated in the wildland urban interface, that place where houses and people meet. That's a positive trend. And then finally, this last goal, cooperation and coordination. What we're seeing over time is increases in state fire assistance. So that's money that's given to the states to help them with preparedness and response. But what we're seeing is flat is volunteer fire assistance. So that would be funds that go to those volunteer fire departments over time. And then FEMA FMAG suppression authorizations. These are fire management assistance grants. So if you are a locality and you have a massive fire in your backyard and you want to petition the feds to sort of help you out, you apply for one of these grants. And what we're seeing is those are increasing over time. And what this is pretty much telling us is that we're seeing more resources being devoted to states and localities related to wildland fire management on the whole. All right, so what does all of this mean? I've taken you through a whirlwind of data very quickly, and I'm just going to try to quickly make sense of it for you. So if we look at restoring fire-adapted ecosystems, acres treated and maintained in desired condition is decreasing, but prescribed fire is increasing slightly. We're treating more acres in the wildland urban interface in terms of hazardous fuels reduction, which is a really good thing. And in terms of building fire-adapted communities, the percentage of acres treated in the wildland urban interface is increasing. Stewardship contracts are on the increase. So there's some good news in there. But the structures are increasing. Structures lost are also increasing. Wildland fire fatalities are increasing. And we're seeing increasingly resources move to states and localities. So if we think about those big trends, I think the bigger question is, is this where we want to be, especially 20 years into policies that have been fairly stable over that period of time? And are we just sort of doing the same things over and over again, and should we be sort of engaging in perhaps a little bit more reflection in terms of what we're doing? Don't we all feel like that some days? Should we be making better progress? Is there a way to frame this problem better so we can get better traction on it? And so that's really what motivated me to undertake this piece of scholarship, was could we be doing a better job? And so what I recommend is that we need a transformative policy goal, something that gives us really something much larger to shoot for, which is a socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime. But what on earth does that mean? Is it a reasonable goal? And so I would like to detail a 5-point action plan that I've sort of laid out that can move us in that direction and open that up for discussion. And as Joe indicated earlier on, if any of this seems provocative to you, or if you have a question that arises, please type it into your little chat box and we'll come back to all those questions at the end. So, yeah, 5 key elements: embrace socio-ecological systems, oriented framing of the problem, identify key leverage points in the system, develop and maintain and shepherd collaborative social processes, create new strategies for solutions, and adapt strategies iteratively. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time sort of talking about this plan. So wildfire as a socio-ecological problem. So I got stuck in trying to understand how all of this was taking place because I was really just trapped in thinking about it from a social standpoint. And when I started to open my mind up to sort of thinking about it from an ecological perspective, I started to get completely different traction on it. So if we redefine wildfire as a socio-ecological system, then maybe we would have a better chance of really understanding some of the dynamics that are at play. And so that means looking at ecological conditions and variables, social conditions and variables, as well as institutions and policies that mediate between those two big things. And so some key questions arise out of that when we frame it differently. How effective are our wildfire policies in managing wildfire socio-ecological systems in the U.S.? And to what extent the spatial and temporal scales of fire policy in the U.S. fit the socio-ecological dynamics that drive the system? So very different questions than I think we usually ask ourselves. So what I'd like to do now is just sort of unpack what I mean by an ecological subsystem, a social subsystem, and how those things come together. All right, the ecological subsystem is driven by three sets of these interlocking variables: exogenous conditions, slow variables, and fast variables. Exogenous conditions, that great big wheel down there at the bottom, are conditions that occur on large or global spatial scales and temporal frames, say over 100 years or more, where slow variables would be regional in scope and cover maybe decades, and fast variables have a smaller spatial footprint and would be something that occurs on a yearly scale or a seasonal scale. The social subsystem is similar in terms of those three interlocking wheels, and would be things like international climate change policy, and slow variables would be wildland-urban interface development and communities at risk at that scale, and then the fast variables would be houses that are actually burned or firefighters that are actually killed. So that's how we start to play with those different spatial and temporal scales, which I think is actually helpful in this. And so this all comes together in this horrendogram that is a bit challenging to see, I think, from where you guys might be. The point here is that we've got three different levels: exogenous, slow, and fast, at temporal and spatial scales, with mediating structures in the middle, meaning institutions or policy that allow us to change the relationships that go on there. And so understanding the system as a complex system in this particular way, we begin to understand the problem a little bit differently. So I want to just walk us through why that may be. So if we think about ecological exogenous conditions, so this would be climate change, and carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels sort of are a big part of that, have been climbing over time. Those trends are predicted to continue. And carbon dioxide or climate change concentrations are highly correlated with mean global temperatures. So those are predicted to basically increase over time. And global fire activity is highly correlated to temperature. So basically what we've seen is climate change models predicting we're going to see more global fire. And that's pretty much what we have seen. So especially in the northern hemispheres, you know, I'm living in Canada now, the boreal forest system, we've had unbelievable fires the last 2 years. Northwest Territories burned up 2 years ago. This last year in 2015, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia had record-setting fires. We're also seeing, you know, what we call mega fire activity in the Mediterranean basin, the United States, and in many other places. So globally, we're really experiencing some very different kinds of changes. And so let's think about that regional level now. What are we seeing at the regional level? At the regional level, we're seeing increasing average temperatures as well. This is just for the western part of the United States. And what happens there is, in the western part of the United States, and the same thing in western Canada, it's very much driven by something we call snowmelt hydrology. So that basically means that as temperatures rise, the snow melts sooner, which means the forests are drier longer, which means they're going to burn hotter sooner. So it's pretty straightforward, at least in terms of that. So we think about just those exogenous controls in terms of climate change, what that does in terms of forcing in the system, and then what happens in terms of the regions, the West in particular. We know that temperature is driving changes in wildfire behavior. We know that temperature is driving landscape level vegetative change, and we know that temperature is driving that snowmelt hydrology as well, which is also leading to larger wildfires. So that's just a little bit we could talk about so many more interactions here, but that's just a quick tour through that. Now let's go through the social subsystem. So when we think about these exogenous variables down here, international climate change policy is sort of something that looms large. And I think it's fair to say there's a lot of skepticism about the efficacy of global climate change policy. So we just had the Paris talks in December. I think people felt very optimistic coming out of that. But Japan just announced this week that they're going to build, I can't remember, a dozen new coal-fired power plants. So, and we're also seeing, China and India increase their sort of coal-fired power plants, which has a pretty big impact. So if we look at what's driving climate change at a global level, what we can basically see is that while the United States has been downwards in terms of per capita emission, basically this is 2012, and so some of this was being driven by the recession. I think it started to tick back up again. But really what's important in this graph is where China and India are headed, which is on very steep trajectory upward. So even the gains that are made in the United States are being swamped by what's happening in China and in India. So I don't think there's going to be a huge change in terms of climate policy anytime in the near future. If we think about those slow social variables, that second category, U.S. monthly housing starts from 20,000 to 2013 have been up and down. So these are huge trends in terms of what's being built in the United States. You can see slowdowns there in 2008, 2009. That was due to the big recession that we had, but now they're starting to trend up. Building in the wildland urban interface correlates exactly with these trends. So when they go down, we don't have a lot of building in the wildland urban interface, and as they start to go up, there's more building in the wildland urban interface. So as long as we have those big trends continuing to move forward, we're still going to have trouble with wildland fire policy. And so that leads to these fast variables, right? If we have climate change, and if we have building in the wildland urban interface, we're going to continue to see structures lost to wildfire, and that's what we've seen from 1999 to 2011. So lots of big trends driving that. And then finally, we're seeing sort of the total rise in suppression costs, and we talked about this already in terms of what that's doing to the Forest Service budget, which it basically means if you end up spending all of your money, 53% of your budget, total Forest Service budget, on suppression costs, that means you only have 47% left over to do everything else as a land management agency. So as the fire management mission of the Forest Service expands, the land management mission shrinks. And that's a losing game. It's a negative forcing sort of feedback, which is very worrisome, and I know there are lots of folks in the Forest Service that are very worried about that. So we go back to my horrendogram in terms of how all these things come back together, those exogenous controls, those slow variables, and those fast variables, and we start to see how all these intersections are. So what we want to concern ourselves with here is sort of some interesting observations. A lot of the press and the media and our day-to-day attention as researchers really tends to get focused down here in this corner. How do we deal with the houses that are burned, the firefighters, the annual acres burned, the annual dollars that are spent on wildfire and fire borrowing? We get really into that, when really what's forcing the system is up here in that left-hand corner, right? It's climate change, it's the change in wildfire regimes, it's this landscape scale vegetative change, and this new thing called asymmetric fire. Where we really need to be working in terms of policy is over here on this other side if we want to effect long-term change in the system. And so if we return to the questions, how effective are our wildfire policies in managing these socio-ecological systems, I'd have to say mixed to poor in terms of what our policies aim to do and what they should be doing. And to what extent do these spatial and temporal scales of policy fit the socio-ecological dynamics? I would say we've got a terrible mismatch in terms of what we should be doing relative to what we are doing. So I think that's worrisome. So our policy attention, I think, is focused in the wrong place. So we return to this goal, a socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime. And I think the question is, maybe we could do a better job if we want to be achieving this goal. So we return to those 5 elements that I laid out initially, this idea of embracing a socio-ecological systems-oriented framing of the problem, and hopefully I've been maybe a bit persuasive on why that's constructive or helpful in this context. Then the next 4 elements: identify key leverage points, develop and maintain collaborative social processes, create new strategies, and adapt strategies iteratively. Well, what do I mean by that? Let's talk about that. We want to leverage key points in the system, right? If we're dealing with these spatial and temporal scales, it's important to deal with these key places in the system so that we can have the biggest effect possible. It's a complex system. So where are these key leverage points in the system? So we know that some of those are where those exogenous controls are, and we know that some of them are where these slow variables are. So where are these key leverage points? Well, I think the key leverage points have to be leveraged through collaborative processes. They have to be appropriate at the appropriate scale. They're probably going to be strategies that are effective at the national, regional, and local levels based on collaborative multi-party processes. They have to define context-appropriate solutions to the scales where they need to work, and they'll incorporate knowledge and create adaptive processes appropriate to those contexts. So what does that actually mean? Well, I've got a few examples that sort of illustrate what we need to hit within this hierarchy of different scales. The first one is we need to recommit to climate change policy. So what does that mean? So if we were to recommit to the climate change policy, it means engaging fully in the Kyoto Protocol. And I think we did some of that probably in December, but I think the question is, what's our follow-through in terms of implementation? So some key things we could be doing are reducing carbon intensity in electric generation, and there's some effort on its way, I think, nationally to do some of that. Invest more in renewables and alternative fuels. This, the federal government is a real driver in this, so some things that the federal government could be doing is accelerating permitting on public lands to do some more renewable work. The DoD in particular is a very large landholder that has a lot of sway in this arena, and we have a lot of federally subsidized housing that could be using a lot of alternative and renewable fuels. We can expand and modernize the electrical grid, increase fuel economy standards, and again, there's some efforts underway to do that, and promote forests as carbon sinks. So those are some things that could be done at that level. At the next level, we need to redefine our landscapes. How do we get more fire on the land? Well, we have to start redefining our landscapes to do that. So how do we do that? So we have some existing programs that have been very effective, and I think it's helpful to point those out because I think that's where our resources need to go. So the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program is one of those that really works at a very large landscape level scale to do some restoration work and put fire back on the land. Integrated resource restoration has been another sort of budgeting and accounting tool to do more integrated land management. An all lands approach, or all lands management, which is becoming increasingly popular. How do we manage all federal, state, and local land management entities working together across landscapes? And then finally, big box burns. One of the best tools we have are large wildfires every summer. And there's been a tendency to want to put those big fires out, but in some cases there are ways to manage those fires so they can actually burn larger portions of our landscapes. And I feel like that's one of the other areas where we need to be doing a lot more work, is to allow those fires to be managed across a larger landscape so they can actually perform a healthy fire function in the cases where they can actually do that. So there's a lot of work. I've been involved in several meetings prior to this fire season, and there's been a lot of talk about how to actually do a better job of that this fire season and last season. A next item is to reprioritize funds to states and localities. And so this is probably the most controversial recommendation that I've made that's received a little bit of traction and a lot of attention, not always good attention. So since a lot of the work is being delegated, either whether they want it or not, to the states and localities, I would argue that we really need to reprioritize 10% of our total suppression budget over to preparedness and delegate that back to the states and localities. And I see this working as a large competitive block grant that could go to the states. They could create 5-year plans that would build socially and ecologically resilient communities. They're the ones who know best how to do this. And it could be formula-based funding based on risk prioritization. So you would have groups of states that were really high capacity and could do this, and so you want to reward that behavior, but you have low capacity states too that really don't know how to do this. How can you start getting them on the track to being able to do this as well? You could include performance incentives that really create a way for them to invest, and there might be options to renew the grants over time. But I think it puts resources in the hands of those who are most capable of addressing the challenges they face. And then the final point is to reimagine the wildland-urban interface. And so the wildland-urban interface is tough because there are a lot, private property rights loom large. There's a shortage of ability to do zoning in rural areas or political will to do zoning in rural areas. And so I think the biggest challenge that we face at the local level is to discourage new building or retrofit old housing to be more defensible, or create opportunities where communities and people that live in the wildland-urban interface can really coexist with that fire. In California, there's a new wildland-urban interface service fee. So $150 per house. Basically, you pay an additional tax if you live in the wildland-urban interface. Those monies are collected and repurposed to fund preparedness activities across the state. California is also pioneering something called fire severity maps. These are guides now for insurers, lenders, and investors to give them a better real sense of information about what risks are faced when they're lending money to people who live in the wildland-urban interface or people who want to insure when they live in the wildland interface. And then finally, state insurance commissions. I wrote an op-ed that got picked up by the LA Times 2 years ago, and this has been a pretty popular thing since then, is to really try to get the state insurance commissioners on board in terms of creating some differential pricing in the wildland-urban interface and something that we call wildfire zones. So can we get the insurance commissioners on board to take a more proactive role? And then finally, adapt strategies iteratively. So one of the challenges we face right now is the limits of modeling and forecasting. Modeling and forecasting are based on historical knowledge, but we find ourselves at a time in climate history where it's really difficult to predict the future based on the past, right? Just because of the dynamics in which we are engaged. And so that's sort of interesting. And so what do we need to do to think about, if you live in the wildland-urban interface, how are you going to deal with what's around you? So some of the tools that are out there now are multiple scenario planning, which is embracing the concepts of non-stationarity, this idea that you can't predict the future based on the past, multiple uncertainties, heterogeneity, multiple scenarios, and using something that are increasingly being known as anticipatory tools, foresight, engagement, and integration, in trying to get experts around the table to think in foresighted, futuristic ways as opposed to thinking about the past. And then finally, something that I think is becoming increasingly important is this idea of collectively establishing trigger points, so you know when a threshold has been crossed in a system and that you are headed into a new system. And so there's been a lot of talk this season that maybe that's something that happened in Tasmania this year in terms of the scale and scope of fire that they experienced in Tasmania and Australia this year. Have they crossed a new threshold where they have to think about their ecosystem and the social system that's embedded in it completely differently? Because all bets seem to be off in some of that fire behavior. All right, so I'm winding down now. And I've pretty much hit all the elements, those 5 key elements that I think are important in terms of this future that we might think about. But one of the things that's missing here is that we really need skill sets if we're going to do all of these things. And, we are educators. We are either students or we are professors, instructors of different types. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about what are the skill sets that we need and our students are going to need in the future. So if we want students to embrace socio-ecological systems-oriented framing, we need to make sure we're engaging in systems thinking, those kinds of classes. How do we get our students thinking about combining the social and the ecological together in systematic ways? If we want them to identify key leverage points in the system, that inherently involves trade-offs. It means taking action at one level and not taking action at another level. That means making normative, value-based trade-offs. And we are not really good. We're good at science, we're good scientists that like to think in very objective terms, but we're terrible when it comes to these normative kinds of decisions. So how do we actually engage in making normative decisions, value-based decisions? Develop, maintain, and shepherd collaborative social processes. That means we need interpersonal competencies. And especially here in the United States, it's been really interesting living in Canada where the civil discourse is a little bit different than it is here. We are increasingly losing our ability just to have the most basic conversations with each other, let alone in these big policy arenas where it really matters. So how do we develop those skills for interpersonal competency to have a conversation that actually allows us to make progress on key and important policy matters? And then finally, the last two, create new strategies and solutions. Some strategic competencies. It's not enough to be a technical expert. We have to also be social and political experts. If you want to have a technical solution implemented, you have to know how to get it through the system and have it implemented. So how do you bring all of those strategic competencies together? The technical, the social, and the political. And adapt strategies iteratively. These are these anticipatory competencies. We have to take ourselves out of that mode of thinking about the past and think about what is it in terms of the future that's going to guide us. So, with that comes a research agenda as researchers, right? To understand these systems, these values trade-offs, these social processes, and the strategies or solutions and these anticipatory toolkits. So not only do we have an obligation, I think, to train the next generation, I think there's also a very lively research agenda here that could take us into the future. So, again, just a reminder, I think our goal is a socially and ecologically resilient wildfire regime that sort of takes us to a new place. And I think that's about it for me today. I would be more than happy to field some questions and hear what you have to say about all of that. So thank you. I don't know how the room is sound, whether people here can hear that. So whenever you say your question, I'm going to repeat it and make sure I've got it right so everybody else can hear it, okay?
I was going to ask, how do you think the agreements that were reached in Paris during the climate change summit, how do you think those are going to impact the wildfire policies?
So the question was, how do I think the Paris agreements around climate change policy in December will affect wildfire policy? So I think that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. So I think the challenge, so a very different, the negotiations in Paris are very different than the ones that took place through the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was a very top-down, let's get everybody agree to these very stringent levels of greenhouse gas emissions and hold ourselves accountable, right? And it turned out we're really terrible at holding ourselves accountable to those kinds of agreements. So that was one way of doing things. The Paris Accords took a very different tack and basically said, you know what, we're going to let everybody come to the table. So China, Japan, India, Germany, Belgium, France, the United States, Canada, come to the table, tell us what you're prepared to do, and let's see if we can get everybody to work together based on what you can do in your own country and try to get to that 2-degree goal. And so that's what they did this time. So what we have instead of one big agreement is a bunch of 179 agreements from all these countries that attended. And so the question is, how do we hold ourselves collectively accountable? It's a huge question. It's incumbent on every country to go back and do what they said they were going to do in order for us to meet this 2-degree, or in some cases 1.5-degree threshold. So I think I don't think anybody knows how it's going to go yet. I don't know how it's going to be measured in terms of, it's all dependent on individual reporting. So I think we've got miles to go. I think there's continues to be skepticism about being able to do it. Some places are, I think, Europe, the EU, has been much more robust and much better at being able to meet some of these goals than other places. So they've been able to figure out, they've got a different level of political will in terms of meeting these commitments. I think the trend, China has committed to doing some new things. But still, just the scale and scope of their energy demands suggests that they're going to be producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions into the near future. So I think there's still a lot of skepticism. Hope, but skepticism. Mm-hmm. Hello. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about this because I'm interested in this particular area about development. We were talking about that. Do you know if, I know you're in Canada now, but do you know if any towns or cities have put more, used fire danger on the list of reasons to institute moratoriums on development? And also, have anybody come back at that and said, well, that's why we should develop, so there's less of a interface or anything like that?
Sure. I don't know of any place that's put an outright ban, and I don't know if you would be able to do that. I guess you could do it, but it would take an extraordinary amount of will to do that. I don't know of any place that has an out-and-out ban. There are a lot of places that have rural, like zoning ordinances or equivalents that are trying to tackle this, and there's a database. I'm trying to remember where that database is or how it exists. If you give me a little bit and maybe talk to me after, my neurons will fire up and I will remember where that is, of where all of those codes and are kept. But I've not heard of anybody saying, oh, let's develop more land so we have less wildland-urban interface. The dynamics here in the United States are a little bit different than they are in Canada. In Canada, 80% of the population lives right at the border, and then the rest of the other 20% sort of live up in, into the boreal forest. And the boreal forest is like this massive wall of trees that goes on forever. And so once you get a fire running through that, it's really hard to stop. So the one picture I showed at the very beginning where that town hall is on fire, I mean, that's a massive building, right? That's the Slave Lake Fire of 2011 in Alberta, where literally the whole town burned down. Because once that wall starts coming in at you, that's a hard one to stop. So the dynamics are very different in Canada than they are here. We have mixes of interface and intermix. And there are some places, I would say there are some places like Flagstaff, Arizona, Prescott, Arizona, Boulder, Colorado, some places like that, excuse me, that have done actually a very good job of creating more fire adapted communities. And so I think those are good places to look to see what they've done through a mixture of regulation and education. Like, for instance, Ruidoso, New Mexico was heavy on the regulation and not so heavy on the education, whereas places like Prescott and Flagstaff have been really heavy on the education and light on the regulation, but they're achieving similar outcomes. So I think the question is, what's the right mix for the culture? What will they take? What will they tolerate in terms of what's going to work in a particular area? So I think it tends to be really context dependent. Question there in the back?
Yeah, you mentioned this new concept of asymmetric fire.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me what that is?
Sure. So the gentleman is asking about what the heck is asymmetrical fire. So this was a term that appeared for the first time in the Quadrennial Fire Review. So that's a 4-year evaluation that's undertaken by all the 5 land management agencies with respect to fire. And so asymmetrical fire is a term that's basically been coined to say we are witnessing fire behavior that we have not seen before. In other words, the wildland fire community really likes militaristic terms, and so I think what they did is adopt it from sort of like an asymmetrical, I don't even know what the term is, but I think the idea is that we're now facing an enemy that has disproportionate power and shape than what we traditionally have known. And so it's a way to express, and you'll hear this if you're out on fires or if you read the newspaper or if you hear this from incident commanders and incident management teams and people who have a long history with fire. We are experiencing wildland fire behavior that we have never experienced before. And I would actually love to do a social media analysis on that to see how many times that term is now appearing, because I think that's sort of the canary in the coal mine that's telling us that we're experiencing something that's very different. So that term was really a leading indicator back in 2009, basically to say we're dealing with something that we really haven't seen before. Bob.
Yeah, you started out mentioning this Granite Mountain hotshot that was killed in Arizona in 2013. And it turned out, by chance today, from 1 to 1:30 on NPR, they interviewed a woman who's coming out with a new book. Actually, it's coming out next week, but I noticed we have one downstairs called Firelands, about that specific fire. At first, it sounded a lot like Norman McLean's book, Young Men in Fire.
Yeah.
Really going into the background of these young people who died. But then at the end, she started talking about the ethical issues. The way we fight fires in this country, and I suppose Canada, is largely by men and women with shovels and chainsaws. And therefore, the ethics of putting human beings between a fire and a structure, whether that's a town, whether that's a multi-million-dollar home of somebody, or a trailer park. And how often does this issue of the ethics of risking firefighters' lives to save structures come up in this whole arena? Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you it's been a big item on the agenda. So every year for the last 8 years, I've attended the
area commanders and incident commanders annual workshop as all the teams get ready to go out and fight fire for the year. And this is the top thing on their list every single year. So there are 13 elite Type 1 incident management teams in the United States. All the incident commanders and the area commanders go to this meeting in preparation to get their teams ready for the next fire season. So that meeting was just last week. Brandon Noel, who is a professor here at NC State with the Fire Chasers Project, that's her there on the left, she attended on our behalf last week because I couldn't make it for the first time in many, many years. And so at that meeting, this year there's been a ton of talk about what's the right thing to do. Should we even be engaged in initial attack as a fire management agency? Which is, if we decide not to engage in initial attack, that means, putting people on the front lines to initially attack a fire, it will completely change the way we manage fire. So the chief this year, Tom Tidwell, had been out on a fire last year where there were lives lost. And that profoundly affected him. And so he came back this year basically saying we're going to do something to change it. But it's not as easy as saying we're going to have a zero tolerance policy. Because if we decide to fight fire, it means people are going to lose their lives. So are we going to, if we put people out there, people will die. I'm 100% convinced of that. But if we don't put people out there, people are also going to die. It's like the military in that respect. And that's also why I think the Forest Service takes a lot of its direction in terms of metaphor and language and use from the military. So I think there's a big question about what do we as a country value if we're going to continue to build in the wildland-urban interface. And that's really sort of part of the story from the Granite Mountain Hotshots, is that was a hotshot team of people from their home community that were trying to defend houses in their own home community, right? And so nobody knows, and I don't think anybody will ever know why those 19 people made the decision they did and why they died. I think it's very controversial, and if you read that story, it's a really tough one. But I don't think it's a coincidence that team died fighting in their own home area. Because I think if you know it's your neighbors and you know that your mission is to get out there and try to help and save somebody, you're going to put yourself and maybe make decisions you might not if it was somebody you didn't know. So I think and I think it's also part of firefighting culture, which has a very brave and heroic culture. We all love our firefighters. They get out there and do things that we would never do ourselves, right? They protect homes. They protect things that we care about in many, many different ways. And so it's part of their culture, and that's what they do. It's one of the last really great professions out there where you get to be a hero. I mean, everything else is called into question in our culture today in so many different ways, but that's a really pure thing still, and it's actually a really nice thing. So I think there's no easy answer. I can tell you that the wildfire community nationally is wrestling with this. The command, the chief's direction that came down this year that was just released 2 weeks ago was basically human life first. So no commander and no team should make any decision that's going to put people disproportionately at risk, as opposed to an all-out ban on initial attack. So that was the compromise that was reached this year. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where this goes in the next couple of years. Canada has a very different policy. They will not put people out on the front line. They will not do this. So it is actually a very different approach than the one we take. So this one over here and then over here.
So I really like your multi-scale, temporal, and spatial framework. I think that's really useful. And I think it makes it really clear that our system is not set up to deal with these broad spatial and temporal scale problems, right? So I wonder about the historical perspective, right? So the last time we had a major change in how we dealt with fires was after the Big Burn.
Yeah.
100 years ago, right? So what is it going to take now to have that kind of seismic change in the way that we're managing these things?
So the question is, from a historical perspective, the last time things really changed was when we had the Big Burn, and what's it going to take this time to make a big change? Another really good question. I don't know, because I would say the things that have happened in the last couple of years, if those aren't enough to change us, what on earth is going to change us? I think the inertial forces at each state are so powerful to continue building and working in the wildland-urban interface until we get states taking some action. And I think this is also, if we start to push the costs back on the states and localities, and they have to absorb more of the cost. I mean, if we spend $4 billion a year, which is what we spent last year, on fire suppression, that is in essence a subsidy to the states and localities for their building practices. If we start to pull that funding away, then somebody else is going to have to figure out how to pick up that tab or absorb the risk and the cost. So I don't think it happens until the funding goes away. I mean, I think that's the last big lever that I've sort of observed. I think that's just a really tough one. I'm going to take one question up here. I've got one. It says, do you include, this is from the chat box, so if anybody out there still has a question that's still online, do you include or are you aware of any further research that looks at the wildland fire policy? How do you think prescribed fire policies may tie into these problems? So prescribed fire is a really good question there, and I think we should be doing more prescribed burning. That's an easy sell to the folks in the Southern Fire Exchange. The question is, how do we do it? And I think as many people are familiar, there are a lot of regulatory reasons that constrain us. There are a lot of behavioral and reasons that constrain us. And so it is in its own right a very complex socio-ecological system that we need to sort of figure out where the right leverage points are in that system and work through that. And I think there's been some really good work through the Southern Fire Exchange and SURPASS to try to deal with those issues in a very comprehensive manner. So, kudos to that. And I had a chance to connect with Jen last week to hear about how progress was going on in that. So, your question? Sorry. Nope. Somebody else over here had a question? Sorry. Uh-huh.
Hey, I liked your talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, we've talked a lot about fire suppression and costs, et cetera. Previous policy compared to current policy, and you mentioned some fire suppression techniques now.
Mm-hmm.
But how much is that to blame about the current severity of wildfires versus temperatures increase due to climate change?
That is a good question, too. I'm going to try to back up. Just let me go backwards. Hang on. I'm just going to back up and show you this one graph because I think it makes my point for me. Right there. All right, you see that dip? You know what that dip is? That's the 10 a.m. policy. Do you know what the 10 a.m. policy is? Fire suppression?
Yep.
Okay. So that's, if we make a decision to put every fire out by 10 a.m. the next morning, and you don't allow fire to play its natural role in the landscape, all of that vegetation continues to build and burn, to build over time. And, that's what we're dealing with now. And so I think management has had a huge impact in this system. And again, it's why it's important to look at it as a socio-ecological system, because management is a social, political decision in terms of suppression.
At some point soon when the current policy will, the severity of fires will go down because of current policy.
You mean so much will burn that will tip back the other direction? Maybe. I think that the estimates, and I can't remember the precise numbers, maybe somebody out there knows how much would have to burn, but it's I think an order of magnitude larger than we're currently allowing to burn. But I guess it's possible. I mean, I think that's part of the rationale I'm saying is that when we have these big fires in the summer, if we could allow fire to play its role on the landscape, that would be the most effective and efficient way to treat those acres out there. But because air quality is an issue, but because we've got people live in the wildland-urban interface, we have endangered species, sage grouse, we've got all sorts of things that sort of constrain us in terms of living in a complex modern society. So it's not quite as easy or as straightforward as that. And it's these trade-offs with all these values, which means we have to make informed decisions about how to deal with these things. So, Joe, I know you need to get to these awards, and I don't want to eat up all the time.
Well, I wasn't going to ask any questions. I have a lot more. Just letting other people ask. So the one question just keeps coming back to me is I really believe that forests can play a great deal in absorbing carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been shown through a lot of analytical work that if you manage forests correctly, you can really absorb a big chunk of it.
Mm-hmm.
Then I look at the U.S. Forest Service, who owns a huge proportion of forest land in the country. Not a huge proportion. Probably the largest landowner. If they were to try to maximize carbon, they could absorb a huge amount of our emissions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what percent, but a large amount. And then I think, well, So you have that policy, and then you have a whole string of environmental and regulatory policies already on the Forest Service. I'm not sure if they could change management to start with, unless you got rid of a lot of them. You know, it's like your brain has developed with all these extra things in it, and you don't really need them anymore, but they're still there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing with the Forest Service. They have evolved with all these regulations, all these policies.
Mm-hmm.
Now you want to do a new policy.
Yep.
Are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, it seems to be a paradox. You can sit, you can face something, you know what it is, you know what you can do, but you can't do it.
Yeah. No, so the question that's been asked, just for the folks who are still online, is that, we have a highly complex web of existing policies, so how on earth do you change something and do something going forward when you've already got this? Is that an appropriate way of, so if you wanted to increase forest management, to increase trees as carbon stocks, how would you do that given the complex interconnecting web of existing policy? And yeah, I think that you interpret selectively in places to allow you to accomplish your given policy goals, right? So if you try to do it nationally, I think it gets challenging, but I think at regional and local levels it gets easier because you're a district ranger or you're a forest supervisor and you've got control over that area. And if you've built reasonable relationships with the people in your area, then you can probably move forward in a more flexible way, regardless of what those rules and regulations are, to avoid a lawsuit or avoid an appeal and to try to make the progress that you think is important. So I think it's harder the higher up you go in terms of policy. I think it's potentially easier the smaller you go, because you have a better chance to work with the people that can potentially block you and get them on your side. So that's mine. Bob?
Oh, well, I'm aware of two long-term national efforts to get at that. One is at the Endangered Species Act, the other is the Forestry Acts to allow for burns that are not allowed now because they kill individual endangered species. And the folks working on them at the national level, they're looking at a 5 to 10 year effort to get this done. The question I wanted is, anybody looked at from a carbon issue that Joe brought up, but from the potential of the carbon put out by wildfires as opposed to the lower level of, presumably lower level of carbon that was put out by those same forests being burned into spry burns that don't take out the whole forest. As a carbon emissions issue.
Yeah, so question is, as a carbon emission issue, what is the difference between, is there any research going on that looks at carbon emitted from a wildland wildfire versus a prescribed fire, presumably for the same base acreage, to sort of see what it is? I know that there's work going on out there. I'm not familiar with it. I know, I want to say, no, I'm not even going to say it because I can't remember it exactly. So I know that there's work going on out there, and I think that's an interesting area. But I think the question is, like, what do we do about it? Because we're still going to have wildfires, right? They're still going to be bigger. And the wildfires, in terms of air quality emissions, tend just to get built in as an uncontrollable event, so they're exempted from the regulations, whereas prescribed fire are treated differentially in terms of those regulations, which creates issues. Elaine?
I was thinking about what you said about different tools for different communities.
Mm-hmm.
And something I think a lot about is why people move into the wildland urban interface.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I'm thinking in the West, this kind of group of frontier migrants, people who are really looking for that frontier experience. They want to be out in nature. And a lot of what you've talked about is increasing regulation and collaborative activities. And then at the same time, we have a community of people who often have a lot of economic and political capital.
Yes.
To resist that to a large
Yes.
degree.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. Another very good question. So, a lot of it has to do with individual behavioral change, cultural change at an increasing level, and I think that it's an incredibly difficult challenge. I mean, and I would just go back to, like, there are some communities who seem to have figured out how to encourage people not to be building in the wildland-urban interface through this mix of education and regulation, it seems like. Those seem to be reasonable paths forward. I don't know. I mean, it's a really tough one.